Good afternoon. It is 12 noon. Thank you for joining us at the Korea Society. I'm Stephen Noerper, the Senior Director for Policy here at the Korea Society, and we're delighted to have a sold-out house and so many people in the audience that we count as friends and supporters. Thank you for taking the time today. Thank you to our students who are also joining us as well, and to those who are streaming online. Delighted to have you listening and looking at this very interesting conversation, we hope, with Joel Witt as we read out what has just happened in Hanoi between President Donald Trump and North Korean leader Kim Jong-un. Certainly a different set of results than some anticipated, but I think Joel and I have had, in our brief discussion just now, a good starting point, which we think is largely that the thrust of the media coverage is not exactly right, and we see some opportunities here. So let me welcome Joel Witt. Joel is the director of the 38 North project at the Stimson Center in Washington, D.C. And of course, 38 North is a leader in terms of thought and analysis on Korean Peninsula security issues. So I highly recommend to those of you not familiar with 38 North, please do have a look online. It's very valuable with a number of remarkable contributors led by Joel. Joel has appeared on a wide array of media, so you may have heard him on NPR, PBS, or any other number of outlets. Thank you very much, Joel, for taking the time to come up, and we're delighted to have Stimson Center represented here through you.
Thank you very much.
And we've just seen this early end to the summit. Some have described it as a breakdown. Others say a pause. What do you see in terms of where we're at and what some of the scenarios might have been for what we had in Hanoi?
Let me answer that in two parts. I think the first part is what happened in Hanoi. And there's this sort of standard narrative emerging about what happened. And what I'd like to do for you is give you three possible scenarios, because I don't believe the standard narrative, although it may be true. I mean, I don't have any inside information. So the standard narrative is the North Koreans asked for too much and they were willing to give too little. And President Trump decided, enough's enough, I'm going home. That's the standard narrative. The second narrative is that maybe the U.S. asked for too much and the North Koreans weren't willing to be more forthcoming. And then President Trump decided, okay, I'm going home. And the third narrative is, which I guess is a variation on the second one, is that at the last minute, the U.S. shifted its position, asked for a lot more than it did going into the summit. The North Koreans asked for a lot more in return, and it may have been too much, and President Trump said, I'm going home. Those are the three possibilities, and I would urge everyone to keep an open mind because, as anyone knows who has followed this issue, the history of U.S.-North Korean relations over the past 25 years, I would say, is the common understanding is sort of the comic book black and white understanding of history. And in fact, the history is much more complicated than the common understanding. And this particular summit, which is obviously part of that history, is already being portrayed in a comic book fashion. In terms of whether was it a disaster or not, I mean, we can talk about this more. That's also the common media narrative. It could be. You know, it's possible that President Trump he came back, he's going to be engulfed by his domestic political problems. The process will lose momentum and maybe peter out. That's quite possible. I'm not good at predicting the future on this issue. On the other hand, you have the example of previous failed summits, not with North Korea, but for some of us who are old enough, we remember 1985 and Ronald Reagan's summit with Mikhail Gorbachev in Reykjavik, where they failed to reach an agreement. It broke up. It was a failure. But a few months or sometime later, a nuclear arms reduction treaty was signed based on some of the progress made at that summit. So, of course, we all hope for that second scenario going forward here. And it seems at least both sides, United States and North Korea, are interested in that, pursuing that second scenario.
I think, Joel, there are a few things that have leapt out at me in the last 24 hours. One is the statements from the official North Korean state news agency, KCNA, that basically painted a fairly positive portrayal of the engagement. They emphasized that it had been regarded as productive by the North Koreans. And that it was aimed at peace. Certainly different than some prior negotiations where you hear a lot of negative, which may be a negotiation tactic. Of course, there was a less rosy picture painted by North Korean Foreign Minister Ri Yong-ho and by the Vice Foreign Minister Che immediately after, but that too may have been a tactic to sort of kind of say this is something that surprised us a bit. So what I'm wondering is if they haven't left a window open here that could be a very good one, and similarly, Donald Trump has said he found it to be productive engagement. So there seems to be a positive spin from both sides, and I don't think we should mute the fact that this may be simply a part A of what may be an AB or an ABC set of summits that lead to real progress over time. And invoking something like Reykjavik is a very good thing, where it looked like Reagan and Gorbachev were not seeing eye to eye, but did come back and did strike at agreement. And I know the North Koreans have looked at that period very closely as they've developed their approach. I've heard that from a former vice foreign minister. So I'm wondering if you see those same opportunities, if that falls on your ears the same way in terms of the KCNA statements.
Yeah, I have a little smile on my face because when you mentioned Madam Che and her negative comments, I've known her for 25 years, and I hope she's not listening, but she's a little bit of an attack dog. So I'm not surprised she was tough and her comments are negative. And I should add to that, though, I think we're friends, and she's a bright, very capable, but very tough woman. I agree. Both leaders are heavily invested in this process, and particularly Kim Jong-un. It's not a tactic. This process isn't for him to gather the international media so he can have a photo op, which a lot of people say. That's not what's going on here. This is a real shift in North Korean policy, and he's trying to move down a different road than the past few years. So they're invested. He's invested. There was progress made at the summit on a variety of issues. It just wasn't enough to reach a final agreement. And President Trump, he's invested, but of course, I think all of us by now understand his mood swings and his quirky character. And so 1 minute he can seem like he loves Kim Jong-un, the next minute he walks out of a summit. This is who he is. And we could look at him walking out as a tactic, a negotiating tactic. It could have had something to do with he was just in a bad mood that day because of the Michael Cohen testimony. Who knows? But he could just as easily switch direction tomorrow and start talking again about how Kim Jong-un loves him. The bottom line, I think, is that it's certainly true that people below him, like Secretary Pompeo, Special Representative Stephen Biegun, they are interested in continuing this process and building on what was accomplished at the summit.
And in the readout, in the press readout at 3 a.m. our time, Eastern time, there was a positive tone expressed by the president in terms of even how that departure took place, that things were done in an amicable way, and Secretary Pompeo was at his side confirming that. But it seemed that there were a few surprises. One clearly is the president did acknowledge that he was distracted by the Cone testimony and considered that an unfair distraction relative to the importance of the negotiations. Another comment he made was that the U.S. Expressed to the North Koreans that they had knowledge beyond the Yongbyon facility, and that caught the North Koreans off guard. And so I'm wondering how you process what seems to be an offer on Yongbyon versus broader concerns about other facilities and highly enriched uranium.
Well, look, the North Koreans may have expressed surprise that we knew about these other facilities, but I don't believe for a minute that they really were surprised. I mean, this has been a discussion that's been going on for years about their other facilities, and particularly their uranium enrichment facilities that aren't at Yongbyon. And for a number of years, they wouldn't even acknowledge they had them. Then when Sig Hecker visited North Korea in 2010, they wouldn't acknowledge that they had uranium enrichment. Then when he visited there, lo and behold, there was a uranium enrichment facility. There had been previous discussions about these other places. So the North Koreans weren't surprised. I mean, that's just not the case. Secondly, I think part of the problem with the summit was you could see it as the possibility of different deals. One deal was Yongbyon, a trade for Yongbyon, which is an important place in terms of their nuclear program, a trade for that. And North Koreans wanted a certain amount of sanctions lifting, maybe some other things. It's not clear at this point what the actual positions were. There was another possible deal, which I think the United States wanted even more, and that was essentially to freeze North Korea's weapons of mass destruction programs. That meant no production of fissile material, bomb-making material, which would have included these production facilities outside of Yongbyon. It may have included missile production. I don't know. That's not clear. And then there may have been another deal where a much bigger deal, a go for broke deal, which went beyond just a freeze to, nuclear weapons, to other facilities, to missile production facilities. That may have been put on the table too. I'm just speculating now, by the United States. So there were all these different options there, and I don't know exactly what happened and why we didn't go for the Yongbyon deal. I think we really wanted, at least going into the summit, to have the WMD freeze deal. But then it gets very murky.
Mm-hmm. One of the things that there does seem to be agreement on is that the moratorium will continue. That was the emphasis of the White House after. And that missile and nuclear testing moratorium is an important takeaway from the first round, but certainly is reinforced by this second round. How do you see that as kind of both an accomplishment, clearly without missiles flying or nukes tested, and how much of that is contingent too on the military exercise issue, which was noted in the...
Well, the first point, is it an accomplishment? And I think the answer is clearly yes. A lot of people will dismiss the missile and nuclear test moratorium, and I think that's just wrong. The fact is, and this was a big concern of the Obama administration as it left office, North Korea was on a technological path to building an ICBM that actually would be more reliable than what they have now, and that would be more technologically advanced than what they have now. And secondly, as we all know, North Korea in the last year of the Obama administration into the first year of the Trump administration was building a hydrogen bomb. So, people can claim, oh, gee, they didn't mean to keep going, but I don't know what the evidence is for suggesting that. The point here is, and a number of us had been saying it for a couple of years, every country that's building nuclear weapons, the United States, the Soviet Union, China, Britain, you name it, they reach a point in their program where they decide how much is enough. They sort of put their finger up, see which way the wind is blowing, and decide, well, gee, do we have enough now? And I think what happened was, at that point, North Korea stopped because it thought, okay, we have enough for the moment. Let's see what else is out there. Let's see what other opportunities are out there in terms of the shift that Chairman Kim made. So I think it was an important moment, and it doesn't mean that they can't resume these tests, despite what they've done at their nuclear test site. There's no destruction of a nuclear test site that is irreversible. It's just not the case. It makes it harder to restart if you're destroying tunnels, but it's not irreversible. And I would venture a guess the North Koreans have contingency plans for restarting testing. So it is important. It can be restarted. The exercises are a key component of this, and the problem with that for us is that, yes, over time, if you can't have large exercises, your readiness starts to degrade. Part of that is because troops in South Korea are rotated every year. So new guys come in, they got to be able to exercise. So we need to be thinking about, well, how do we deal with that problem and continue the suspension of the large exercises that's in place?
The suggestion then, if we lean forward, that we get back to the table, and I know this is something that the South Koreans are quite bent on. Do you want to entertain a few scenarios about next steps? And do you think with Trump visiting Japan in May and the G20, do you see a potential for another round sooner than not? Do you think this is an A of a B process where we may move forward on issues like sanctions in exchange for a partial declaration and some level of verification? It seems that the two leaders are bent on the meetings. There are benefits to it for Trump, clearly. There's potential for a foreign policy win at a time of a lot of domestic consternation. For Kim Jong-un, trying to find some economic relief, and the appearance on a global stage, which he seems to be more comfortable with the second round than the first, but clearly brings him global media attention he wouldn't otherwise get. They have motives to get back to the table. And South Korea certainly would like to see that. Would you like to speak a bit to the South Korean angle as well as to the likelihood of what may follow?
I sort of joked that my crystal ball on this issue self-destructed years ago. So I always hesitate to make predictions, and I can't predict what's going to happen, particularly with this administration, which is, shall we say, quirky. And I think the special representative we have is a very capable guy who understands the issues, is very pragmatic, is very much committed to making this a success. And that's very important. And I'm sure he has access to President Trump, and, but how much of that really works or not, I just don't know. So I really can't go beyond saying, yes, it seems like both sides are committed to this process. Yes, it appears Secretary Pompeo and the special representative And even President Trump said, yes, we want to continue this. And my hope is that President Trump is very invested in this and understands that this is almost like, making a real estate deal. And if you think about it that way, I'm not a businessman. I'm sure there's some businessmen here. You walk away from the table sometimes, that's not good enough. I'm going home. And if everyone's invested, eventually they come back to the table, and maybe that has some effect. So I think that's what we can hope for here, but I can't guarantee anything.
One of the things that impressed me with this latest round, and then listening to the readout from Hanoi, from the President and the Secretary of State, it seems that they're listening to their advisors more. There seems to be a bit of a more measured tone. And I see you smiling on that, but I do sense that there's at least an acknowledgement that the denuclearization process is rather complex, and we're on a longer timeline than many, maybe a year ago, would have necessarily thought. That there isn't a quick end to this, that it requires a level of patience, which I think should also augur how we look at judging this a success or a failure. And I do happen to think too many people have pronounced it a failure too quickly. We're on a process that may be a longer term one, and that seems to be explicit in those acknowledgments. I would take it that way. I also do take your point about a moratorium as being at least a step in the right direction, right? It keeps tensions lower. But I also wonder on the clock here, because for Trump, as we get close to the next election cycle, there will be many distractions. Clearly, with Democratic candidates taking foreign policy positions, there will be a lot said, notably when it comes to the North Korea question on humanitarian aid and human rights. Interestingly, Otto Warmbier came up in the press briefing. Trump offered an excuse that Kim Jong-un said he didn't have personal knowledge of that, although a statement has just been released from the Warmbier family that they clearly don't take much comfort in that. That just came out the last hour. So I think we're into some complex processes here that require a good deal of patience on the part of those of us who spend time observing it, and on the part of the news media, and some sensitivity to the timing involved. And I would throw into that mix the timing around Moon Jae-in and the need for some gains to maintain political viability, given the pressures he faces at home.
Well, let me make 2 points. Yes, there seems to be more of a realization over time about how complex dealing with this issue is. That doesn't surprise me. There's a certain amount of education that goes on with every president, with every senior level official in any administration in dealing with the North Korea issue. They're not experts. And I think a lot of them have bought into the myths of North Korea. We've all heard the myths before. Hermit kingdom, about ready to collapse, the history of our relations with them. So it takes a certain amount of education over time from practical experience, but also from people who have some firsthand understanding of dealing with the problem. In that context, this is sort of a warning. Don't assume that the people doing the educating are always the ones you want to be doing the educating. That hasn't been the case in previous administrations. I think I'm working on a book about Obama, Trump, and North Korea, and I think in the Obama administration, some of the people doing the educating wouldn't be educating the way you would want them to be doing it. So all you need to do is look around the Trump administration and find people who might be doing the educating who you wouldn't want to be doing the educating if you wanted diplomacy to continue. Secondly, and this is part of the thinking behind this book. Before all the Trump initiative started to evolve, I wonder, looking back over the past 25 years, whether the U.S. is capable of dealing with a threat, with a problem like North Korea. It seems to me that between the myths that have emerged about our relations with North Korea over the past 25 years, the traditional foreign policy thinking about how to deal with this very untraditional problem, and the basic lack of understanding of North Korea inside Washington, inside the US government, and you throw on top of that the politics of this issue, and it becomes enormously difficult, almost impossible to deal with it. And the one thing that President Trump has done, which I've talked about before publicly, he's cut through all that. So, we can argue about President Trump and everything else he's done, and I'm not going to argue about it because, as I've said before, 99% of what he's done I don't agree with on other issues. But on this particular issue, he's cut through this sort of Gordian knot that we've been dealing with and has really, I think, made a strong and valiant effort to deal with it. But he's not the right person to do this, obviously. He's not steady. He's quirky. One day he wakes up, he thinks one thing. The next day he thinks another thing. And that's going to create a lot of problems. And it certainly did in Hanoi.
One of the things the president acknowledged, and this is my last point before we turn to our audience here, is that there are partnerships involved. And he cited the United Nations. He mentioned the multilateral context, which might catch some by surprise, thinking that he's a unilateralist or certainly opposes globalism and multilateralism in some context and disregards alliances in some context. But what he was saying was that this is a complex situation that requires the acknowledgement of contributions from, and the order he listed was Russia, China, and he made additional comments about China being helpful, Japan and South Korea, and he also noted at 2 points needing to wring from Air Force One both South Korean President Moon Jae-in and Japanese Prime Minister Abe. So at least in terms of a public expression of international support and international resolve on this, I was impressed that there was that extensive of a mention. But I wonder if you have thoughts on the international complex and the element of support here for US-DPRK.
Well, that's certainly an element of learning on his part. I think that's evidence of learning because that kind of attitude hasn't always been apparent. And I'm sure, we may have instances down the road where it won't be apparent again. I mean, that's who he is. I don't know if he listed them in that order, but certainly that's the wrong order. South Korea obviously is the central player here. And Russia should be last on the list, not first, because Russia has never been a central player in this process. So it's encouraging that he mentions the contribution of others, and hopefully the administration will do more to work in cooperation with these other countries on this issue. One of the problems has been, of course, over the past year or so, is that they really haven't connected the dots. They really haven't figured, okay, we need to bring along this broad international coalition with us, and that requires a certain amount of interaction with them, which I don't think was really present. And maybe that's changing once again now that we have a special representative. Their job is to keep consulting with all of these countries, to make the rounds, to talk to them about what we're doing, to get advice from them. And I think certainly Steve Bacon understands that. So that's a step in the right direction. But at the end of the day, it's important, but all roads lead to Washington, and this has always been the case. You know, for years I've been listening to people talk about China's role in dealing with North Korea. And yes, China has a role, but I think it's been wildly exaggerated at times. They aren't going to solve this problem for us. It has to be the United States working with South Korea and to some degree Japan.
Well, join me in thanking Joel Witt for his time today.
Thank you.
Please do see 38 North if you're not familiar with it. And know that we have at the Korea Society a dedicated summits page that tracks a lot of this with expert input and analysis. That's available to you free at koreasociety.org. There, too, you'll find future programs, and we will be continuing a lot of focus on this. You will also see an opportunity for membership, and we would love to have you all as members. I see two of our $500 level member supporters here today, so thank you for those who contribute. I wanted to thank Fred Carrier, who's in the audience, a longtime vice president of the Korea Society, members of our board, Whitey Kim and Phil Sherman, nice and gracious contributors like Julia Quincy. Thank you to our students as well, and thank you for all your time. So we hope to see you again at koreasociety.org. And for our next policy program, thanks to Jonathan Corrado, who did all of the hard logistics and lifting, and to our staff and interns. If you'd like to sign up for membership, I see Bo McKim at the back of the room. Thanks again, and have a great afternoon.